So hello, I see some people have started to enter. Welcome to this week's Laudato Si Animator session. As always, I invite you to share your name in the chat box. I'm doing that now, so you'll all see where it is, but you can share your name and where you're from. We have a good representation from around the world at these sessions, and so it's always interesting to see where people are coming from and sometimes make connections when we find others in our area. So I invite you to go ahead and do that. And we'll just give 1 or 2 minutes for everybody to join and then begin the session for today. We're going to begin the program, although feel free to continue introducing yourselves in the chat box. As mentioned, it's always wonderful to see where people are coming from. So welcome today to the second session in the Laudato Si Animators program this Lent, Judge the Church's Response to Climate Change. As always, we will begin with a prayer, and so I'll lead us now in the prayer for preservation of creation. If we can take a moment to calm ourselves and put ourselves in the presence of the Lord, Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Amen. God of the universe, we thank you for your many good gifts, for the beauty of creation and its rich and varied fruits, for clean water and fresh air, for food and shelter, animals and plants. Forgive us for the times we have taken the earth's resources for granted and wasted what you have given us. Transform our hearts and minds so that we would learn to care and share, to touch the earth with gentleness and with love, respecting all living things. We pray for all those who suffer as a result of our waste, greed, and indifference, and we pray that the day would come when everyone has enough food and clean water. Help us to respect the rights of all people and all species, and help us to willingly share your gifts today and always. Amen. Amen. So moving forward, I know that many of you have joined last week, but for those that didn't, just as a reminder, the Laudato Si Animators program has 3 main sessions: See, Judge, and Act. Last week, we went over the science and effects of climate change. For those of you who missed the discussion, the webinars, the discussions take place on Thinkific, our online course platform, and you can find them there. gccm.thinkific.com is the website, and you can join the Lent 2019 course. And then after we end, we always invite you to participate in a final project. This year, our main final project is on Earth Day. Earth Day falls the day after Easter in 2019, so what we've done is moved it to the week after, which is Mercy Sunday, with a campaign called Mercy to Earth. This comes from an invitation of Pope Francis a few years ago, suggesting we add an 8th work of mercy, mercy for creation. And so we are inviting people to hold a tree planting ceremony, recognizing the importance of trees in biodiversity and combating climate change, and in solidarity with those in the Amazon, since much of our work this year will be focused on that. And at that, also put in place an advocacy program. We have a template to write letters to government leaders in order to meet the Paris agreements. No country is currently on track to keep their emissions low enough that we would stay below 1.5 degrees Celsius warming. So we'll be doing that. And next week during ACT, we'll be hearing more from animators who have been through the program before, the activities that they've taken on, and going over in more detail the action that we can have. So I'm moving now to our speaker for today, and very, very pleased and grateful to introduce Sister Margaret Galiardi, who has joined us. Sister Margaret is very accomplished. She has worked in with homeless, worked on theology, worked as a teacher, and had a long career, and she worked at the Intercommunity Center for Justice and Peace in Manhattan while residing in a convent that was a shelter for women who were homeless, battered, or released from prison. She has served as the Theological Curriculum Coordinator for the Lay Leadership Training Program of the Diocese of Rockville Center and is the former Executive Director of Spiritual Life in West Hartford, Connecticut. She served in 1995 as the co-promoter of justice for North America for the Dominican Order and on the Dominican International Commission for Justice, Peace, and the Integrity of Creation. She is a lecturer on ecological theology and an author of 2 books, Encountering Mystery in the Wilderness, One Woman's Vision Quest, and Where the Pure Water Flows, the New Story of the Universe in Christian Faith. She is a retreat leader, a spiritual director, and currently offers spiritual direction and accompaniment and is available for directed retreats, workshops, and lectures. We're very grateful that she's able to join us today, and I am pleased to turn the talk over to Sister Margaret.
Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining. I'm just going to set my timer here so I can keep track of what I'm doing. Good. All right. So I know that last week you looked at the science of global climate change. And so this week we are devoting our session to the Church's teaching on care for creation with a specific emphasis on the document Laudato Si. First, let me say a few words about the context in which we find the Church's teaching on care of creation. The teaching and the encyclical itself finds its home within the collection of major official documents commonly referred to as Catholic social teaching or Catholic social thought. These documents, and there are about 18 of them, the first of which was promulgated in 1891, sum up the Church's teaching on social justice issues. They promote a vision of a just society that is grounded in the Bible and in the wisdom gathered from experience by the Christian community as it has responded to social justice issues throughout the history. They are a central and essential element of our faith, whose roots are found in the Hebrew prophets, in the life and words of Jesus himself, who proclaimed, "God has sent me to bring glad tidings to the poor, liberty to captives, and recovery of sight to the blind." From all of these documents, we cull what's called the major principles of Catholic social thought, namely the dignity of the human person, solidarity, the dignity of work and workers' rights and responsibilities, option for the poor and vulnerable, care for creation, and family, community, participation, and the common good. I want to emphasize that Catholic social teaching, sometimes referred to as the best kept secret of the Church, is a central and essential element of our faith. As stated by the bishops gathered in Rome in 1971, action on behalf of justice and participation in the transformation of the world fully appear to us as a constituent or essential dimension of the preaching of the gospel. So, with this very important context in mind, we explore the Church's teaching on care for creation in general and Laudato Si in particular. And let me note that I have inserted inclusive language into the quotes from the various encyclicals. So, care for creation first shows up within the body of Catholic social thought In Pope Paul VI's letter, which was issued on the 80th anniversary of the very first social encyclical, which was called Rerum Novarum. In this document, Pope Paul raises up questions which, and here I quote, because of their urgency, extent, and complexity, must in the years to come take first place among the preoccupations of Christians, so that with other people, Christians may dedicate themselves to solving these new difficulties which put the very future of humankind in jeopardy. He then goes on to enumerate several issues, one of which he calls, and again I quote, the environment at risk. He states, now listen carefully to this quote, it's amazing. He says, humankind is suddenly becoming aware that by an ill-considered exploitation of nature, we risk destroying nature and in turn becoming the victim of this degradation. And I continue with the quote, not only is the material environment becoming a permanent menace, pollution and refuse, new illnesses, and absolute destructive capacity, but the framework is no longer under humankind's control, thus creating an environment for tomorrow which may well be intolerable. Again, 1971. He concludes this section with, this is a wide-ranging social problem which concerns the entire human family. If you're feeling like I'm reading from one of the reports from the IPCC, you wouldn't be far wrong. It's an amazing pointing to the future, harbinger of what was to come. It's 1979 when John Paul II, in his first encyclical, The Redeemer of Humankind, bemoans the fact that we humans see no other meaning in the natural environment than what serves for our immediate use and consumption. A thought which moves him in a papal audience to encourage and support, again, I quote, ecological conversion. Then again, in 1987, on a letter about the church's concern for the social order, John Paul says this, the dominion granted to humankind by the Creator is not an absolute power, nor can one speak of a freedom to use and misuse or dispose of things as one pleases. When it comes to the natural world, we are subject not only to biological laws, but also to moral ones, which cannot be violated with impunity. You hear in this document, again, a harbinger of what we'll find in Laudato Si about humankind's relationship to nature. And then in 1991, he issues yet another letter in which he points to, and I quote, the irrational destruction of the environment, and speaks of ways in which we have refused our role as cooperator with God in the work of creation, and instead set ourselves up in place of God, provoking a rebellion on the part of nature. He tells us we think we can make arbitrary use of the earth subjecting it without restraint to our will, as if it did not have its own requisites and a prior God-given purpose, which we must not betray. Again, themes which will be picked up in Laudato Si. Pope Benedict, whose pontificate, one more slide ahead, okay? Pope Benedict, whose pontificate ran from 2005 to 2013, used his 2009 encyclical Caritas in Veritate to point what he called to the oneness and indivisibility of the book of nature, a oneness which includes the environment, life, sexuality, the family, and social relations. Again, a harbinger of what we'll hear in Laudato Si on integral ecology. Perhaps anticipating the criticism that Laudato would receive from some sectors in church and society, Pope Francis did two things. First, he picked up statements in prior Catholic social thought referring to the care of the earth, and he developed them more fully. And secondly, he quotes more than a dozen bishops' conferences from around the world, nesting his encyclical in the wisdom of the wider global church. So no one can say creation care is the latest fad of a progressive pope. Work done by Episcopal conferences in Australia, Bolivia, Brazil, Canada, Dominican Republic, Japan, Mexico, New Zealand, Paraguay, the Philippines, Portugal, South Africa, the US, it's all quoted. The Holy Father also drew from the work of the Latin American Bishops' Conference, from the Federation of Asian Bishops, from the Patagonian Bishops' Conference, all of which, again, nests his teaching within the wisdom of the wider church. A very important factor to note here, something which is mostly overlooked, I think, is that the bishops' conferences came to write about creation care because they were called into it by the convictions of the faithful who were themselves involved in efforts to protect creation long before most of the bishops' conferences put pen to paper. In particular here, I would mention scientists and women religious. I want to turn now to Laudato Si and offer a brief sketch of the document and its major themes. Then I will point to what I think are three significant concepts in the document, which I think are very important for those of us working to try to reverse global climate change. The first is the intrinsic value of all creation and the concept of dominion. The second is human identity. And the third, the concept of integral ecology. As you may know, the document has 6 chapters and is about 192 pages long. With regard to climate change, Francis unequivocally names human behavior as a major cause of global climate change and urges all sectors of society to examine our actions, policies, and behaviors in light of this urgent situation. And I quote from paragraph 23 of the document, "A number of scientific studies indicate that most global warming in recent decades is due to the great concentration of greenhouse gases released mainly as a result of human activity." So, the document begins with a brief introduction in which he says, "Earth, our sister, is crying to us because of the pain we have inflicted on her." And he sets out here in the introduction a major theme, the major theme of the encyclical. How inseparable the bond between concern for nature, justice for the poor, commitment to society, and interior peace. One seamless garment. In chapter 1, he does a kind of body scan of the planet. Climate change, water, loss of biodiversity, decline in the quality of human life, breakdown of society, and global inequality. And then he says something very important. He says, our goal in this document is not to amass information, but rather to become painfully aware so as to dare to turn what is happening in the world into our own personal suffering, and thus to discover what to do about it. In chapter 2, he takes up the Christian message in relationship to the planet. And this is important. The encyclical is addressed to every person living on the planet. But here he takes up the Christian message. And he says very directly, we must forcefully reject the notion that our being made in the image of God justifies absolute dominion over other creatures, all of whom have value of their own in God's eyes. We'll come back to that statement. Chapter 3, the human roots of the ecological crisis. Here he picks up what's called the technocratic paradigm. Logic and science alone attempting to control nature, to assert power over it, to assume an infinite supply of goods and materials, and thus overlook the human. Chapter 4, what's called integral ecology. Nature cannot be regarded as something separate from ourselves. Again, this is a theme we'll come back to. Talks about the common good and not only solidarity, which identified before as one of the major themes of Catholic social thought, but intergenerational solidarity, or concern for the generations to come. Chapter 5, he sets out lines of approach and action. Now remember, this document was written right before the Paris Climate Summit. So he's kind of giving a hint as to where we need to go. He's saying international gatherings have not produced binding documents that carry penalties for non-compliance. And he says we need global consensus on planning for sustainability and regeneration. Talks about a global social commons. And then finally, in the 6th chapter, it's about ecological education and spirituality. He says many things need to change, but it is we humans who need to change. Again, a theme we'll come back to. So there are 10 themes that appear repeatedly throughout the document. Relationship between the poor and the fragility of the planet. Everything is connected. He critiques the new technocratic paradigm. He calls us to seek other ways of understanding the economy and progress, not just about amassing goods and profit. Again, states the value proper to every creature. He talks about human ecology, understanding the nature of the person. Talks about the need for forthright and honest debate, serious respect of international and local policy. He critiques the throwaway culture, and he tells us there is a need for a new lifestyle. So now I want to highlight 3 themes for the encyclical say a word or two about the worldview they suggest and explain how the relevance of this worldview is important in trying to respond to the issues of climate change. So the first theme I want to pull out is that of intrinsic value of all creation and the concept of human dominion over the planet. This is mentioned repeatedly throughout the document. I'm just going to give you 3 or 4 places, okay? At one point he says, and again I'm quoting, "Together with our obligation to use Earth's goods responsibly, we are called to recognize that other living beings have a value of their own in God's eyes. By their mere existence, they bless and give glory to God." Again, in that same section, the church does not simply state that other creatures are completely subordinate to the good of human beings, as if they have no worth in themselves. Listen at times to the news. Listen to what you hear, and it's stark contradiction to what the Pope is telling us. Again, he says, "We must forcefully reject the notion that our being created in God's image and given dominion over the earth justifies absolute domination over other creatures." So, a hierarchical view of creation, a pyramid with the human at the top and everything else under the heel of the human, is no longer adequate. In fact, it is at worst a detriment and at least a misunderstanding, the encyclical suggests. The Pope is calling to attention to the inherent, intrinsic value of every creature, not just humankind, every creature. Every being has been gifted by God with a deep interiority and self-organizing principle by which it becomes more and more what it is, independently of any use by humans. The dust of the earth, what we used to call crass matter, has become, in the words of the encyclical, and I quote, "the meeting place between the divine and the human." More to the point, all creation as is being seen in a kind of communion in which each distinct being, including, of course, the human, but not only the human, has its own dignity and worth in the hymn of the universe. The second concept I wish to highlight is our human identity. The Pope tells us we have forgotten that we ourselves are dust of the earth. Our very bodies are made up of her elements. If you look at this slide, it's quite stunning, actually, in symbolically recognizing our deep connection with the planet. Nature cannot be regarded as something separate from ourselves or as a mere setting in which we live. We are part of nature, included in it, and thus in constant interaction with it. God has joined us so closely to the world around us, the Pope tells us, that we can feel the desertification of the soil almost as a physical ailment, and the extinction of species as a painful disfigurement. Really? Really, can we hear the cries of the earth? Or has our exalted view of ourselves on top of the pyramid made us deaf to the cries of the planet, obscured our vision, clouded our perception? We no longer experience ourselves as of the earth, as earth come to consciousness, as earth reflecting back on ourselves, on herself. We no longer experience ourselves as the universe in the form of the human. Rather, we have bought the great lie that humans are separate from the rest of nature. Neil deGrasse Tyson, director of the Rose Planetarium in New York City, reminds us, we go out to observe the night sky, but we forget that not only are we in the universe is in us. The iron, the calcium, and so much more, forged in the stars, flows through our bodies. And finally, the third concept, integral ecology. Everything is connected, or in the words of the encyclical, we are not faced with two separate crises, one human and the other environmental, but rather one complex crisis, which is both social and environmental. Pope Francis reminds us, quoting the words of Proverbs, "The rich and the poor have equal dignity before the Lord, who is maker of them all." With the bishops of Bolivia, he reminds us that the gravest effects of the attacks on the environment are suffered by the poorest. He pricks our conscience by reminding us what we all know from within the depths of our own experience. The natural environment is a collective good. It's the inheritance of all humanity and the responsibility of everyone. With the bishops of New Zealand, he asks us, what is the meaning of the commandment, "Thou shalt not kill," when 20% of the world's population consumes resources at a rate that robs poor nations and future generations of what they need to survive? Strategies for solution, he tells us, demand an integrated approach to combating poverty, restoring dignity to the excluded, and at the same time, protecting nature. Pope Francis, like Thomas Berry before him, whose thought runs very much through the encyclical, but who unfortunately is not mentioned even in the footnotes, is telling us that the planet cannot be saved in fragments. Look at the photo of Earth, our common home from space. There is one planet, one water system, one fragile and precious atmosphere surrounding us. Before we are French or Chinese, Filipino or Australian, African or English, we are earthlings, sharing one precious planet. Thomas Berry gets right to the heart of the matter when he reminds us we will go into the future as a single sacred community, or we will perish together in the desert. In paragraph 11 of the encyclical, we read, there needs to be a distinctive way of looking at things. Policies, an educational program, a lifestyle, and a spirituality, which together generate resistance to the assault of the planet. Then, toward the conclusion of the document, he almost pleads with us. We need to bring forth an awareness of our common origin, of our mutual belonging, and a future to be shared by everyone. This basic awareness would enable the development of new convictions and attitudes and forms of life. A great spiritual and educational challenge stands before us, and it will demand that we set out on the long path of renewal. It seems that Francis is challenging us to what author and Teilhardian scholar Ursula King describes as a spirituality that is a leaven, a fermenting agent that may deeply influence and shape every aspect of our lives, so that our faith is linked to our bodies, to nature, to relationship with others, and to society. If we are to engage around global climate change and invite others to do the same, we must first internalize the intrinsic value of all creation, loving and valuing all creation as God loves and values all creation. Letting go of our misconceived role of dominion, and I would add, even steward, adopting instead a posture of kinship with all. If we are to engage around global climate change and invite others to do the same, we are called, I believe, to glory in the reality that we are dust of earth, dust of the stars, knowing that this same dust was assumed by Jesus and will hence forever remain the meeting place between God and humanity, and is thus worthy of all of our efforts to preserve it. If we are called to engage around global climate change and invite others to do the same, we must live out of an experienced sense of oneness with God, with earth, with one another, and especially those who are poorest among us. Living always out of the inexhaustible depth of the present moment that remains unspoken. All of this, I believe, is the journey to which Laudato Si calls us to.
Thank you so much for that comprehensive and educational and beautiful reflection on the church's teaching on care for creation, the history and how it is rooted in our teaching, to the current teachings of Laudato Si and the world we're in today. So I invite everyone who's attended to feel free to ask questions now. We can, I see somebody raise their hand. Please instead type questions in the chat box. We're not able to turn the screens on for different people. It ends up being too long of a technical challenge. So go ahead and type the questions in the chat box, and we'll do our best to answer as many as we can. So someone asked the question of what intrinsic value means in terms of, our relation with other creatures. So they specifically mentioned, what about, are we killing insects? Are we harming them and their intrinsic value? but it's probably a wider question about how we interact in the ecosystem while recognizing the intrinsic value.
Mhm. I think what I would say about that, from taking it from the wider perspective, and thank you for that, Marissa, is we in our role as humans set about fixing all kinds of things, which we then later on find out that have to be unfixed because we were mistaken in what we did, mistaken and both harmful. I think of the example here in the United States, in Florida, in the Everglades, how we straightened out all the rivers, and now we're in the process of unstraightening them. It's to really believe that there is a wisdom in the universe that calls for the intelligent participation of the human, but with a realization that we must respect the fact that we are not the only ones, humans are not the only ones that count. If you read the ecological literature, you'll hear over and over again about anthropocentrism, about the human on the top of the pile. That's part of what we're talking about. Even a rock, which is not alive, technically speaking, has its own intrinsic value. There's a lot of reflection that's called for here. I'm not sure we can do this work without deep contemplative practice.
Thank you. Another question about whether the notes will be available. So just wanted to share that the materials are available on Thinkific, so we can put some of the quotes there as well as a discussion question. And I invite others who might have questions to share those again in the chat box. Again, I saw someone, Felicia, I believe, who raised their hand, but we can't turn the screen on that way, so please type your question into the chat box. So I'll just mention, one came in. What are some of the first steps to authentic kinship with Mother Earth when balancing our lifestyle and the demands of a technocratic workplace?
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the first things that I would say is we need to develop the practice of going outside with intention. We go out of doors very frequently, but most times to go back inside. We very rarely go out of doors with the intention of experiencing, of opening ourselves to the intrinsic value of all creation. So I always add, if I'm able to, in retreats that I give, and suggest that people add to their own personal prayer practice, that activity of going outside with intention, of gawking at some element of creation, a tree, a flower, and really beginning to understand that this flower, this tree, this rock has value in and of itself to God, even if a human never even lays eyes on it. That is, I think, a practice which opens up a huge area of reflection.
Another comment that came in was someone who said they couldn't think of exactly how to phrase this as a question, but grappling with that he does see a difference in humankind. That there is something different about humankind versus other parts of creation, and that was just his comment, sort of that he sees that there is some sort of a difference, and what does that mean for if there is a difference, and how does that
absolutely, of course there is a difference. Okay, if you recall what I said in the presentation, okay, when I talked about the single, well, Thomas Berry would use the expression, the single sacred community of life, okay, each being is unique, and each being has its own role. And we as humans have our own role. As far as we know right now, we are the only ones who have what's called self-reflective consciousness. We know that we know that we're going to die. All right? We don't know for sure that any other being, any other creature has those capacities as of yet. So it's not to deny that each being is unique, okay? But it's to use that capacity for the good of the whole. Remember the terrible tsunami in Indonesia? And there was quite a bit of reporting, I think it was the one in Indonesia, quite a bit of reporting about how all the animals went to higher ground before the humans realized what was happening, okay? So, you know, the animals have instinctual capacities that we don't have. It's not a question of denying our role as humans. It's a question of respecting the unique differentiation of other beings and allowing all that to work together for the common good.
Yeah, thank you for that. I would add one comment to that, which is Bill McKibben, who also has written a lot about the end of nature and humanity and our relationships to nature, and has talked about how where humans do have this uniqueness is, as Sister Margaret mentioned, in our consciousness, and far from meaning that gives us more dominion, it gives us more responsibility. And that where other animals where other creatures have an impact on the ecosystem as well, they don't have a choice but to do what they're doing, whereas we can consider our actions.
Yeah, and that dominion quotation has been so misunderstood and is responsible for so much damage. The actual Hebrew word, that word dominion in the text of Genesis, the actual Hebrew word is to care for creation as God cares for creation. I mean, for my money, retire the word. It doesn't mean that we don't have our own distinct role, but it has been so distorted and done so much damage.
So I think we have time for one more question. And so for those of you who asked a question that we didn't get to, we'll put many of these up on the discussion section for us to discuss as a group. So don't feel that you'll be ignored. We'll try to grapple with it in our own way. So I think, sorry. So the question that just came in actually, I think, is a good one, especially for some of us in some parts of the world where I see this as well. And that is, someone mentions that she meets almost daily attitudes from well-meaning and devout Catholics who sort of denigrate the care for animals, and particularly contrasting care for animals in pro-life activities as if one would diminish the other. And so just asks, how or why do you think this body of beautiful teaching is not more well known to the laity, and how can we bring this together in a seamless garment again, more directly, and recognize that these are parts of a whole?
Well, I think it's not well known among the laity because it's not been preached. Even Laudato Si. How has that been preached? How has that been integrated into the life of the everyday parish? I mean, I know that that's going to be some of the work you're going to do, and I salute you for doing it. In bringing this work forward, bring it forward in the context of the body of Catholic social thought. This is, I said a number of times, a central and essential element of our faith. This is not some sidetrack, okay? So how we bring it forward is very important. When we talk about, for example, respecting animals, we need to do it in a way that acknowledges the whole picture. And we can't, I don't think we can blame these Catholics who have grown up in a culture that has, I mean, the earth was a platform. In the olden days, the distortion was presented in this way. The earth is a platform we live on until we can leave it and go to heaven, where what really counts, what really matters is happening. Okay? This is a complete reversal. So we have to really do our homework. We've got to do our study. We have to present things carefully. And we have to go from what people know to the new and not try to shock people. It's very important. This is critical work that's to be done. And it's to be done carefully with great sensitivity and not, these folks, many of them only know what they hear on Sunday morning. And I'm sorry to say that this has not been integrated into the daily and the Sunday homilies. I mean, now we have at least a season of creation, but in how many parishes is that even mentioned? That's going to be part of your work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that. And it truly will be. We have in the global Catholic climate movement, engaging more parishes, more dioceses in general is a big part of our action in the season of creation, and bringing people into it and trying to integrate care for creation into the liturgical rhythm of the church as well. We have a program called Laudato Si Circles, which is really meant to be sort of a time for building that community and building that prayer base and moving towards ecological conversion within parishes. And as we move towards the Earth Day events, we'll be giving you tools to try to talk about this within your parish, to identify who are some of the leaders within your community that you can bring this up with. And again, really emphasizing this with your pastor as well, and mentioning again and again that it needs to happen. And I would also say, having worked in parishes for many years before joining GCCM, that if you do have a pastor who's speaking on this, to reach out and say thank you. I'm in an area where this isn't even a particularly controversial subject, and the last time my pastor preached about care for creation, he was stopped by three separate people after Mass, to be told that he was talking about politics and this wasn't something that the church should be getting into, and how upset they were. So if you do have a pastor who is willing to speak on this, unfortunately, it's not as accepted as that teaching needs to spread. So do reach out and say thank you and support them for that. And if they're not doing it, reach out. Reach out and say, ask why not, and encourage them to do so.
And ask those priests who are doing it, would they be willing to gather a couple of other pastors in their area and have some conversation about them? Provide them with the tools they need in order to do it. They don't know it either. Mm-hmm. Be interesting to find out how many normal parish priests have read Laudato Si.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, bringing the pastors together as well. We heard on Friday, we held an event, and someone mentioned that it was 15% of priests had read the document, and some of us said that seemed a little high, that we thought it was closer to 10. So yes, absolutely. So as we're approaching the end of our hour together, I want to thank Sister Margaret so much for joining us today. Thank you for your time, for the presentation, for answering some of our questions. Again, if your question was not answered, we will be including these discussion questions online. So just a few housekeeping notes. Again, if you have not joined Thinkific, although hopefully everybody has at this point, that's where all of these discussion questions are taking place. We also have an ongoing Lenten campaign, so many of you have already probably decided on what you're giving up for Lent, but you can always add another. And our campaign currently is Eating Simply. For Lent, we encourage you to eat only plant-based meals throughout Lent, not just on Fridays. And if you are unable to do that, to add at least one other day. And this is because of the impact on climate change. Meat has a major impact. But sorry, I'm skipping down. So this is sort of the pounds of CO2 emitted to create different food sources. And as you can see, beef and pork are quite high. And then the other reason is that we're supporting our brothers and sisters in the Amazon as we move towards a synod of the Amazon that the Vatican will be hosting in October. And beef in particular is the largest driver of deforestation in the Amazon. So in solidarity, we're asking people to fast as well. And then, sorry, just moving quickly. Next, we also invite you to think about taking action either through the climate strikes. So last Friday, 1.4 million people took to the streets asking for strong action on climate change. This is something that we can do as well. This is something that you can invite your parish to participate in. You can also use this as an opportunity, while we're not saying strike against the church, but as we're advocating with with authorities in government, this is also an opportunity for us to think about what the church itself is doing and write to our parishes and dioceses and ask if we also have plans to stay below 1.5 degrees Celsius and to integrate care for creation throughout the work that we're doing. And then again, as I mentioned, our Earth Day campaign will be coming up. Next week, we'll be focusing on ACT. I'll go into more details, providing some toolkits for some of these different actions that I mentioned now, and we'll also be hearing from people who have done the Animators program before and are now organizing within their community. So on the session that takes place 12 hours before this one, 9:30 p.m. In East Coast United States on Wednesday, 9:30 a.m. in Manila on Thursday, so you can figure out where you are in that time zone. Louis Clovis, who leads our GCCM chapter in Klang, Malaysia, will be joining us, and Chris Hawk, an animator from Alice Springs, who has started a prayer circle within her community, Alice Springs, Australia. And then on the program that takes place at this time next week, we'll hear from Agnes Richards, who is organizing GCCM Canada, and Svetla Yaroshova, who has started a prayer circle in Prague. So we'll get to talk to people from different contexts and hear how they've put this in place in their community. So, Helmut, yes, all of the links to the events that I mentioned will be put up on Thinkific as well. So thank you, everybody who joined us today, and thank you again, Sister Margaret, for your
all blessings to all of you.
Thank you. Blessings as well. Have a wonderful night or day, depending on where you are, and we will continue the conversation. Best.